In September of 2002, a man sat down in front of a camera in Nevada and described a room, he said, was buried under the desert. For years, the argument about Area 51 has run along one line: secret aircraft or something stranger kept underground. But there is a detail in this account that the retellings smooth over, and it has nothing to do with the room or the cold or the thing he said was inside it. It is not what he saw. It is not what it told him. It is the name because another man, in another decade, in another state, had used the same one first. That name was circulating in print 3 years before anyone publicly tied the two accounts together. So where did it come from? I want to start with the name, not the room, not the cold, the name. The being at the center of this story is called J-Rod, not a gray, not a visitor, not an entity. J-Rod, with a hyphen, spoken the way you would read a part number off a shelf. That specificity is the first strange thing, because the word is narrower than anything the wider lore usually reaches for. The version most people have heard is clean: one captive being, one facility under the desert, one continuous program, 2 men beside the same creature. It is a tidy story. It is also not the story the 2 men actually told. One of them said, plainly, that his being was not the other man's being. I will come back to that, because it is the hinge the whole thing turns on. But I want to be honest at the start about what I am doing here. I am not going to tell you a being named J-Rod exists. I am going to ask a smaller question, and a stranger one. Why did 2 men, who disagreed about almost everything else, reach for the very same name? The man in front of the camera in 2002 went by Dan Burisch, sometimes Danny Crane, and almost everything about how he was introduced is disputed, starting with the letters after his name. In his own account, he was a microbiologist with advanced training, brought into classified work at a place he called Sector 4 near Groom Lake around 1994. That is the biography he presented. It is worth saying slowly what parts of it can be checked and what parts cannot. The investigative reporter George Knapp at the Las Vegas station, KLAS, looked into the credentials and returned to them again in 2005. The University of Nevada, Las Vegas confirmed one thing: an undergraduate degree in psychology. The doctorate Burisch claimed from Stony Brook in New York. The university told the station it had no record of him. Not a sealed file. No record. The journalist Linda Moulton Howe, who edits an outlet called Earth Files and who was not hostile to him, went looking in 2004 for the same paperwork. She reported that no diploma and no confirmation from the university had been produced at that stage. So here is the discipline I will try to hold for the next half hour. I will report the claim and the gap in the same breath, and resolve neither. This raises a simple but critical question, and I want to leave it open rather than close it. If the credential at the center of a man's authority cannot be found, what happens to everything he says on the strength of it? I have spent the better part of 2 years with these transcripts, and 18 months of that trying to reconcile the record with the man on the camera. I have not managed it. That failure is part of what I want to describe. So here is the room, exactly as he described it in 2002, and I want to give it to you in his order, not mine. You go down. That is the first thing. The facility he described was not a building, but a depth levels, stacked under the desert floor, reached by elevator, moved through by something he likened to a small internal monorail. There were roll-up doors. There was fingerprinting at the thresholds. And there were badges, and he was specific about the badges. Orange and blue, different colors for different levels of access, the kind of mundane bureaucratic detail that a person either lived or invented. The work, as he told it, was biological. He described a transmission electron microscope. He described viral slides. He described tissue held under identifiers, letters, and numbers, not names, the way a lab catalogs a sample it does not want anyone to be sentimental about. And he described a suit, which he called a TES suit, that a person put on before going down to the lowest level, because the lowest level was not built for people. That lowest level is where the account stops sounding like a laboratory and starts sounding like something else. He described a sealed environment at the bottom of the facility, pressurized, cold, not chilly, but a cold he framed as hostile to an unprotected body. And the atmosphere inside it, he said, was heavy with hydrogen. When an interviewer pressed him on what exactly this containment was, he gave the phrase, "The whole story now hangs on." A pressurized hydrogen clean sphere, yes. A hydrogen clean sphere. I have turned that phrase over for a long time, because of what it is and what it is not. It is not a beam of light. It is not an operating table under a hovering craft. It is a specification. It reads like something copied off an engineering placard, and that texture, procedural, unglamorous, almost boring, is exactly what makes it hard to file. A person building a story to thrill you does not usually reach for the words pressurized hydrogen. Inside that sphere, he said, was the being, J-Rod. He described biological sampling tissue, taken, studied, catalogued. He described proximity, routine, a working relationship rather than a single encounter. And he described communication, which is where I have to be careful, because the popular retelling has hardened this into something more definite than he did. He described the contact as telepathic. In later interviews, he reached for a more technical phrase, electromagnetic entrainment, as if trying to give a mechanism to something he could not otherwise explain. I am not telling you that any of this happened. I am telling you this is the room he described, down to the color of the badges. Those are different statements, and the difference is the only thing keeping me honest. There is one more piece, and it is the piece the retellings inflate the most. Burisch described a future descendants, altered timelines, a catastrophe with a date. But here is what almost nobody who repeats the story preserves. He did not present all of that as something poured into his head through the glass. Large parts of it, he said, were things he had read, things he had been briefed on. Material, not revelation. I have read this passage more times than I can defend, and every time I catch on the same place. Not the sphere, not the timeline, the badges, orange and blue. Because a man assembling a myth reaches for the cold and the hydrogen and the descendants of humanity, he does not usually stop to tell you the color coding of the access cards. That is the detail that keeps me in the chair. And it turns out it is not the only one. There is one detail in the supporting testimony that made me stop, and it is almost aggressively unremarkable. It does not come from Burisch. It comes from a woman I will call Maria T., a medical laboratory technologist, and that is not her real name. She described, in an account collected privately in 1996, working a long shift in a cold room, hands doubled inside nitrile gloves, and the thing she could not stop returning to was not anything on the far side of the glass. It was her own hand. I kept thinking about the crack in my thumbnail. The crack in my thumbnail. A split nail, catching inside the glove, all shift. That is what stayed. Not the cold, not the sphere, not the being. A snagging thumbnail. Here is why I lean forward at a detail like that. When people fabricate, they smooth things out. They give you the light and the table and the overwhelming sensation. They do not give you the thumbnail. It is too small, too dull, too human to be worth inventing. And it is exactly the kind of thing a real body remembers instead of the thing it was supposed to be looking at. Now, here is where the skeptic in me raises a hand, because the objection to all of this is strong, and I take it seriously. I have been a skeptic my whole working life. The objection goes like this. This is not testimony. It is accretion, a small community of researchers, telling and retelling a set of stories that reinforce one another until the repetition itself starts to feel like evidence. There is no authenticated document. There is no hardware. There is no biological sample anyone can test. The central figure's credentials do not check out. The facility he describes has never been shown to exist, and every element of the mythology, the underground base, the captive gray, the reverse engineering, was already in circulation before he ever spoke. People who hold that view are not cranks. George Knapp, who has spent more time on this ground than almost anyone, said of an earlier Area 51 witness that he would never be able to prove the man's claims. Never be able to prove. That is a careful investigator naming the edge of what he can stand behind. The researcher Glenn Campbell, who watched Groom Lake for years, doubted the underground facility. And the Central Intelligence Agency, which admits much about the base, denies the rest. Not fraud, exactly. Not delusion, exactly. Not proof, either. Something in between, and harder to name. I concede the objection is legitimate. Then I want to narrow it, because there is one thread it does not quite cut. If there is a physical object at the center of this, it is a document, and the honest thing to say about it is that its trail does not go cold at the end. It was never lit at the beginning. Let me walk it as a chain, the way you would trace any piece of evidence, one link at a time. The first link is the origin, and there isn't one. There is a text, it carried a label, and inside it the string AQJ Rod, and the name Danny B. Crane. Where it was written, and by whom, and under what authority, is simply unknown. I do not know who wrote it. I have tried to find out, and the trail stops being a trail. The second link is where it sat. Through the late 1990s, it lived where documents like this always live inside a research network, passed between people who collect this material, surfacing on the early internet. The third link is who found it, and this is the one genuinely interesting fact in the whole chain. The investigator Bill Hamilton says he came across that document online in 1999. He also says he had already heard the name J-Rod years earlier from the engineer Bill Uhouse, and he says he did not meet Dan Burisch until 2002. So the paper and the name were both in front of him before the man most associated with them ever sat down across from him. The fourth link is transfer, and it is just more of the same hand-to-hand, researcher-to-researcher, no release from any institution, no chain of signatures, nothing stamped. The fifth link is where it is now, which is unverifiable. I want to be precise about the language, because it matters. This is not a declassified government paper. It is a document that circulated among researchers under a label. That is the most it can honestly be called. There is one more thing I was told, and I can only give it to you fenced. A researcher privately, not an agency, not a program, was said to have kept an archive of interviews on all of this, and that archive is said to have dispersed after he died. No catalog, no control number, no public copy. I cannot verify even that it existed. I include it only because it is the shape this whole story keeps making, a source that is always one custodian removed from anyone who can check it, never lit at the beginning. The strongest thing this story has is not a photograph or a sample. It is a series of blank spaces where those things should be. Start with the academic record. When the station went looking for Burisch's doctorate, the answer that came back from Stony Brook was not that the file was sealed or restricted or classified. It was that there was no record. His supporters had an answer for that. The records, they said, had been erased. And I want to be fair. I cannot disprove an erasure. But notice what has happened. The absence of a file has quietly been converted into evidence of a cover-up, and those are not the same thing. Then the facility. There is no open government record confirming an underground installation at Papoose Lake. Independent analysts who have gone over the high-resolution imagery argue there is nothing there to see. No traffic, no structure matching the description. The official explanation breaks here, its supporters say. But it is at least as likely that the official explanation breaks because there was never anything under the mountain to explain. Then the sample. For a story built on biology, tissue, slides, sampling, there is no specimen. Nothing preserved, nothing testable, nothing replicated. And then the smallest absence, which I can only give you through a pseudonymous source, a record storage contractor I will call Robert, describing a day in 1999. He did not describe a document. He described the place a document was not. There was a space where a folder should have been, where a folder should be. A clean rectangle on a dusty shelf, no title, no number, nothing to request. I am not going to tell you that empty rectangle proves anything. An empty shelf is the opposite of a document, but it is the exact texture this case keeps producing, not a locked door, just a gap where the thing should have been. Burisch was not the first person to say the name, and that is the part that keeps this from being simple. Go back to the engineer Bill Uhouse. In his own telling, his work started in the 1950s and ran for decades, building a flight simulator meant to teach human pilots how to handle a disc-shaped craft, one he tied to a machine recovered in 1953, and he described a being who advised that work, a technical consultant sitting in on the engineering. He had a name for it. I call them J-Rod. I call them J-Rod, not a specimen behind glass, a colleague, more or less. And crucially, Uhouse placed his being in a different world than Burisch did a Los Alamos and Area 51 network, engineering rather than biology. The chronology matters, so hold it carefully. Bill Hamilton, a UFO investigator who had been at this since about 1976, says he heard the name from Uhouse first. Then he found that document online in 1999. Then, and only then, in 2002, did he meet Burisch. The name traveled ahead of the man, and Burisch himself drew the line I keep coming back to. Asked about the Los Alamos being, he did not claim it. He pushed it away. That, he said, would be Bill Uhouse's account, not the being he said he met at Sector 4. Now go back further, to 1989, and Bob Lazar. Before Burisch, before the document, Lazar had already put Sector 4 and Papoose and reverse-engineered craft into public circulation. Knapp, who broke that story, later said he corroborated some mundane details around Groom Lake and found evidence Lazar had worked at Los Alamos while still saying the central claim could not be proved. Even Lazar, notably, was cautious about live beings when he was pressed in December of 1989. The evidence suggests something much larger, not a creature, but a vocabulary, a shared set of words in circulation for years that a later account could be built out of. So what do we actually have when two men use one name? Not the same room, not the same decade, not the same job, the same name. That is the whole coincidence. And I am not going to tell you it is more than a coincidence. I am telling you it is a strange one. When you stop blending the accounts and lay them side by side, 5 distinct layers appear, and I want to be precise about this. I am not building this list. I am reporting one that is already sitting in the record. Layer 1. The designation. It comes to us first through Uhouse, by way of Hamilton. I call them J-Rod. J-Rod. That is the layer that ought to be simplest and is actually the strangest, because the word is so specific, not a description. A designation. Layer 2. The containment. This is Burisch. In 2002. A pressurized hydrogen clean sphere. Yes. A specification standing in for a sighting the claim wearing the clothes of a procedure. Layer 3. The exchange. Here the two accounts part ways. In Uhouse's, the being advises engineers. In Burisch's, the being is a biological subject. A technician I will call T. W. A simulator contractor recalling a night in 1981 described the room this way. Everyone waited as if somebody else in the room had answered. Somebody else had answered. The being has moved, across the accounts, from specimen to collaborator. Layer 4. The contact. Burisch reached for that phrase, electromagnetic entrainment. A technician I will call R.M., describing an afternoon in 1994, put the same feeling less clinically. It was more like remembering one I hadn't learned yet. He tried again. Later, it wasn't a voice. A voice comes from somewhere. Not a voice, not a thought he chose, not language he recognized, something else. Layer 5. And here's the strangest part. The warning. The story does not stop at a captive being helping with machinery. It climbs, in Burisch's telling, into descendants of humanity, altered timelines, a catastrophe with a date somewhere around 2012. Where that fifth layer actually comes from, I genuinely cannot tell you, and remember, he himself said parts of it were things he read, not things poured into him. Asked how a man in his position could carry knowledge like that, he deflected downward, every time. I'm just a lowly biologist that looks at patterns. There is real silence around all of this. The hard part is deciding what the silence belongs to, because the secrecy is not imaginary. The Central Intelligence Agency's own history is explicit. Groom Lake was chosen for its remoteness and built to hide airplanes. The U-2, the A-12, under the program name Oxcart, crews shuttled in by air from Burbank. Later, the first stealth prototypes, under the name Have Blue. This was one of the most secret pieces of ground in the country, and it earned that secrecy honestly, for reasons that had nothing to do with anything alive. The same agency that admits all of that denies the rest, the basement, the saucers, the captive gray. And Knapp reported a smaller, stranger thing worth attributing precisely to him, that Nellis Public Affairs once confirmed there was a location designated SFOR somewhere on the range, where certain equipment was tested, and that a later inquiry got a different answer. That is his account. It is not a record placing SFOR under papoose. The two are easy to blur, and they should not be. So here is the temptation, and I want to refuse it out loud. The temptation is to read the silence as suppression, the coordinated burial of a secret. I am genuinely uncertain about that, and I keep landing somewhere simpler and almost more troubling. A bureaucracy built to hide aircraft, encountering a category of claim it has no box for, and choosing, at every turn, the path of least documentation. The silence was deafening, people like to say, but a machine that was already silent, for its own ordinary reasons, does not have to be hiding your particular thing. I want to be careful about one more claim, the one the loudest versions lean on hardest, that psychic contact traumatized these men into breaking their silence before they died. I found nothing that supports it, so I am not going to say it. I am going to leave it where it belongs, in the lore, unproven. So let me try the story a different way, because I think the popular version has quietly done something to it. The popular version fuses the two men, one being shared between two programs, two witnesses to a single creature. But that is not what they said. Burisch drew the line himself. That would be Bill Uhouse's account. Uhouse's account, his phrase, pushing the other man's being away from his own. So run it the other way. Not one being shared by two programs, two accounts, one name, two separate claims that happen to reach for the same word. And if that is what happened, then the thing they shared was never a creature at all. It was a designation. The name may be the only thing that ever actually passed between them. And watch what the name does after that. It splits. In the later lore, one J-Rod quietly becomes several different beings, different origins, the single word budding into a category. The creature multiplies on paper while never once appearing off it. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The story grows by replicating the name, not by producing the being. I am not resolving this. I want to be clear that I am proposing a shape, not a solution. But I think we may have spent this whole time trying to identify a creature, when the thing actually traveling from account to account, decade to decade, mouth to mouth, was 5 characters and a hyphen. I want to go back to Burisch. Because of all the things he said, the one I keep returning to is the smallest. It is not the sphere. It is not the descendants of humanity, or the date on the catastrophe, or any of the material a person would build a legend out of. It is a habit of speech. Every time the story swelled toward something enormous, the future, the fate of the species, knowledge no ordinary person could hold, he shrank the description of himself back down. I'm just a lowly biologist that looks at patterns. Looks at patterns. That is the phrase I keep returning to. A man supposedly at the center of the largest secret imaginable, reaching, over and over, for the most modest possible word for what he was. I do not know what to make of that. I genuinely don't. A fabricator, you would think, inflates himself. The story is a platform for the man. Here the man kept stepping off the platform, kept making himself small against a backdrop he described as vast. Maybe that is humility. Maybe it is a very good instinct for how belief is built. I cannot tell you which. I can only tell you that the smallest sentence in the whole account is the one that has stayed with me longest, and I have never been able to decide what it means. So here is what I am left with, and none of it resolves. Where did the name come from? Why that name a designation so specific, when every easy word for a gray was already available? How did two men, a decade and a state apart, working in different fields, land on the identical one? Did one of them read the other, somewhere, and simply forget that he had? If the name moved through the research network before either interview, then who carried it first, and from where? Why did Burisch take such care to separate his being from Uhouse's if the whole thing was a single invention he could have merged? What is a clean sphere worth as evidence if no one can ever open the door to it? What is a document worth if its trail was never lit at the beginning? If a mind can be entrained, as he put it, then whose memory is the one you are finally left holding his, or something placed there? And if none of it happened at all, no sphere, no being, no descendants, then why is the version everyone repeats the neat one the two men themselves refused to tell? What, in the end, actually survived all of this? The being, or only the word for it? I went looking for the thing at the bottom of this, the specimen, the paper with a real seal on it, the name of whoever wrote the first line of the first document. I did not find it. What I found instead was a word that outlasted every attempt to anchor it, passed from a man in the 1950s to a man in the 1990s to a camera in 2002 and onward, still moving, still attached to nothing anyone can hold. 2 rooms, 2 accounts. One name that each man said arrived from somewhere he could not point to, and on any shelf anyone can open, nothing that proves either of them was ever in the room.